So welcome to the next part of an article of mine that, by the way, has been rejected. If the world, or at least the part of it, concerning animal sexual identity is strictly deterministic, it arguably makes little sense, I wouldn't say no sense, but it arguably makes little sense to recommend to an agent a strategy upon which he should act when faced with the dilemma. He will become homosexual or heterosexual depending on some psychobiological or sociobiological cause, even if he be in the middle of Kinsey's scale in the first place and have some natural ascetic talent, unless he will not skid at all, as would then be dictated by some other cause. We're in the realm of determinism now. Nonetheless, evolutionary game theory or decision theory may still want to find out who of those that did skid significantly up or down the scale are the winners and who are the losers. Of those with the preferences and so on that create the dilemma case. If Camperio Ciani's findings really reflect a common cause for fecundity and male homosexuality, then the homosexuals should turn out to win, since it is rather they than the heterosexuals who have a larger than average family, which is worth X utility units, despite their lack of the additional Y units which they would get when living an undisturbed heterosexual life in the homophobic environment. The heterosexuals will lose despite their gain of the latter Y units. They are not bashed, since given the common genetic cause for the two states of affairs, female fecundity and male homosexuality, in the moment they turn heterosexual, it is plain that their family will tend not to be larger than average, and thus they will rather not get the X units that this outcome of a family with more than average kids, that this outcome would be worth. This was the first preference of the agent, to have a family larger than average. Should the heterosexuals turn out to win, then Camperio Ciani's correlation cannot possibly reflect a causal relation. In this sense, my dilemma may provide a test scenario for Camperio Ciani's account. If, however, on the other hand, nature, I just try to check all the options that there are. I try to test all the options and discuss all the options that there are. If, on the other hand, nature has made room for a kind of indeterminism to be interpreted somehow as a kind of free will, there are still at least two causal constellations in which the homosexuals would win, and which are not ruled out by the evidence as published in Camperio Ciani. Although I do leave aside the dubious possibility of some kind of backwards causation, meaning an agent by becoming homosexual determines the genetic disposition that his female maternal relatives already had at earlier points in time, earlier than his decision. I leave aside that as a dubious possibility, especially when I have been reproached for using or arguing for some kind of backwards causation. But the first of these causal constellations that I do think worth discussing is still somewhat odd, and passionately Einsteinian scientists are advised to skip it. Einsteinian scientists are those scientists who agree with Einstein that God doesn't play dice. In other words, that there is no real chance, and that there is nothing indeterministic at the basis. It is, however, mentioned because nothing may rule it out completely. There may be a strong and mutual causal relation between fecundity and homosexuality, but the seemingly odd couple as a whole is indeterministic in its occurrence and simultaneous, and so in some sense the result of the collective entangled free will of a family. If one thing arises at one end, the other thing, or some kind of similar thing, arises at the other end. through some kind of non-local influence. It's just one thing that happens and that in its occurrence cannot be determined. This constellation rejects the premise that the genetic code does not change as a fertilization and builds on hypotheses such as Löwdin's that it is quantum tunneling that could lead to spontaneous genetic mutations responsible for aging or the development of cancer. A common common thesis. Quantum tunneling leads to aging or the development of cancer. Cancer develops through some kind of quantum mechanic trigger effects at the very bottom of our genes. Likewise, biochemists and quantum physicists should scrupulously check and see whether or not there might be non-local simultaneous effects at work amongst the genes of different individuals of a certain family that are reflected at the psychobiological level by an increase in fecundity among females and homosexuality among their maternally related males. The second causal constellation now is much more straightforward. Einsteinian scientists may listen again. Moreover, it also applies to the following hypotheses concerning the evolution of homosexuality. First, that there is a homosexual genetic variation, which is not necessarily, or at least not so immediately related to a male's maternal female relatives, as Camperio Ciani suggests. And second, homosexuality is to some degree, and either in a chaotic and thus pseudo-indeterministic or even well-predictable way, sociodynamically determined. That explanation or causal constellation would also explain the correlation of Camperio Ciani and be compatible with these theses or hypotheses on homosexuality, on the evolutionary advantage of homosexuality. This constellation would involve orthodox causation by freely, freely as it is here, some kind of by freely choosing or being genetically and also socially determined to be another reproach, another reservation that someone had, and so hence the inverted commas. By freely choosing or being genetically and or socially determined to be homosexual, the males actively contribute to the fecundity boost among the females in their maternal family. Why rule out that hypothesis? It would explain Camperio Ciani's correlation. The social dynamics, whose roots may, of course, nonetheless be genetic, which produce a certain number of homosexuals, could be adaptive if these homosexuals, in turn, sociodynamically increase their maternal family's number of births. This hypothesis could, of course, be thwarted if a significant number of females have already been born and proved to be overly fecund before overly many homosexual maternally related family members are born or conceived. Otherwise, especially given the mean age of 33.22 in Camperio Ciani's homosexual sample group, it could be a substantial hypothesis worth testing. The birth dates of the relatives and coming out dates or other parameters of the homosexual males were not taken into consideration in Camperio Ciani, 2004. And because of the lack of empirical evidence that I have now, I'm also trying to replicate Camperio Ciani's study and take into account all these data. Now I'll finish that, and after that I will explain homophobia from a scientific perspective. Both of these causal constellations would resolve the dilemma in favor of the homosexuals. It is only if the female fecundity is one fixed thing and the sexual orientation of the males underdetermined, albeit somewhat affected by it, that there can be a chance for the heterosexuals to win the game. And in my view, this Camperio Ciani hypothesis explains homophobia. The others don't.